Well, on a ship, you can't run away. You have got to be, let's say you're on a cruiser with a crew of 800 men, and you've got to be as brave as your captain decides to be that day. And whatever you may feel down there in the engine room, that if the captain decides that he's going to charge at the enemy, you're going to go with him.
Hello and welcome to the Aspects of History podcast. My name is Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor. Now today I have a treat for you. Two renowned historians, Max Hastings, I should say Sir Max Hastings, Knight of the Realm, and Saul David, friend of the show. They are here to discuss Max's book, Operation Pedestal. Now this book came out last year and I found the interview between the two knocking around the Aspects of History archive, so I thought why not share it with my faithful podcast audience. Now you probably haven't heard of this operation, I certainly hadn't, but the more of Max's book I read, the more compelling the story is. We're in August of 1942, so it's the 80th anniversary next month, and the Royal Navy is sent on a mission to relieve the island of Malta, which was under threat of starvation and invasion at the hands of Axis forces. The relief naval convoy, that includes aircraft carriers, battleships, and ships of the merchant navy, has to set sail from Gibraltar to Malta, a distance of over 1,000 miles, or 1,700 kilometres, through the Mediterranean that was effectively in the control of German and Italian forces. The flotilla had to contend with U-boats, air attacks, and the psychological effects of not knowing when and from where an attack would come. I do hope you enjoy their chat. I certainly did listening back. If you've got any comments and want to get hold of me, you can via the Twitter at OllieWCQ, or you can email me, history@aspectsofhistory.com. As ever, I'll put links in the show notes for you to find out more, and I'll hand you over to Saul and Max.
Right, let's crack on. Let's get. Oh, and yeah, just as I said in my email, Max, I mean, many congratulations, because to have the energy to keep going and produce books of that quality is really astonishing, and it's looking very encouraging. I mean, I like to keep an eye on these things, even if you don't, Max. I don't know how studious you are about checking on things like this, but with all the reviews you got last week and the pre-orders that seem to be going in, I think you're going to be way up there in the charts again before too long, I think.
Anyway, I'm sitting here this morning writing about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And,
yeah.
Actually, what I try these days, one deliberately writes books within a narrower compass. In other words, I'll never do another book the sort of magnitude of All Hell Let Loose or Vietnam or something, because it's just too exhausting. I mean, you find, for instance, when I wrote Nemesis about the Far East War, and I remember spending the best part of a month on the chapter about the dropping of the atomic bombs, because the issues are so complex and it is also vast that you were sort of waking up every morning thinking, am I physically fit enough to tackle this? And I think it's smart to do. I never forgot hearing somebody say about John Keegan. He started out writing some very good books and they got worse and worse. And I thought, well, pray God, I never find myself in a place. Well, of course, poor John had a huge amount of physical pain, which of course was that's one of the reasons he had more and more trouble, and he couldn't do the research. Anyway, you crack on.
Yeah, just one last comment on that, Max. I think there's a danger with all writers actually to rest on your laurels, particularly when you've had a certain amount of success, and to keep going at the quality you have. And Anthony actually is really remarkable, because anyone who's written a book understands the sheer amount of physical and mental energy that goes into it is not to be underestimated. So it would be very tempting, frankly, is what I'm saying, to be able to take your foot off the pedal. But of course, as soon as you do, the quality will drop, I suspect.
You just have to, I think it's very important to almost say to yourself that this is the first book you've ever written, and to tackle the issues, to just look at the issues, close your eyes and just think, forget everything I've ever done before. Let's just think about this. And I was just sitting here just before we tuned in now, writing about JFK in 1962. And you just sort of, I almost try and write the paragraphs as if I'd never written about anything about anybody ever before.
Yeah. It's very good advice. It's very good advice. That won't get into the interview, but it should do. All right, Max, I'll crack on because I know you want to get back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the first question that struck me actually when I was reviewing it was, given that it is your first naval history, why this story and why now? And why do you think you haven't done a naval history before this point?
I'm always trying to think of things that I've got something new to say about. And because I've written so many books about the Second World War, that there are a whole lot of campaigns that I don't feel I can revisit without cheating readers, because I'd be going over very familiar territory. But I've never really written at length about the Royal Navy. And I wanted something, what I wanted was a story with a beginning, a middle, and an ending, around which I could try and look at some of the issues about the Royal Navy in World War II and generally. I'm a huge fan. I've always read a lot of naval history. And for instance, I've always been a huge admirer of Nick Rogers' history of the Royal Navy, and in which Nick said something very important. He said there's a myth that the shooting of Admiral Byng in 1759 or whatever it was an act of stupidity for failing to relieve Minorca. But Nick Roger argued that actually it had been a terrific success story for the Royal Navy, because it absolutely galvanized them and changed their culture. And after Admiral Byng was shot on his own quarterdeck for failing to relieve Minorca, every naval captain for the next 200 years knew that he'd be forgiven for losing a battle, but he wouldn't be forgiven for failing to fight one. And I'm sure this is a very important and true statement. Another thing that always makes me laugh more recently, I was talking to my dear friend Michael Howard, who died a couple of years ago. But Michael, just before I started writing this book, and we were talking about the culture of the Royal Navy, which is a wonderful culture, but it's not a cerebral one. There's a sort of, I've said in Pedestal that there's a sort of rather bit like the atmosphere on a warship in action of a boys' boarding school, of this sort of noisy, often naked, odorous, smelly masculinity. And Michael Howard said to me in his inimitable way, he said, I have met many intellectual soldiers and even some intellectual airmen. I have never met an intellectual sailor. And of course, Michael was camping it up a bit. But nonetheless, there was a truth. Sailors do tend to be doers. A lot of them are rather mistrustful of the thinkers. They say, can we shut up and get on with this? And it was during the Falklands War, I always remember, a naval staff officer on the command ship showing me a signal from the Admiral, oh God Almighty, I'm forgetting his name from it, who was commanding out at
Woodward, was it?
Woodward, out at sea. And Woodward was 200 miles offshore with his carriers. And he sent a signal to us in San Carlos being bombed. More or less, it was a sort of very captain of games sort of signal saying, everybody better brace up and take a grip. And the staff officer who showed me the signals said, how can you deal with a bloke who sends signals like this? So the Royal Navy's culture is something very different. It's something terribly interesting. And I love the opportunity to address this. And it did help because I was a correspondent in the Falklands, and one had seen ships sink and one had seen aircraft shot down and so on. And you know what the atmosphere is like there. There are certain things that are completely different about war at sea. For instance, on shore, soldiers always have a choice about whether to be brave or not. That quite a lot of them in an attack will sort of lie there and wait to see whether it succeeds before they get up to decide whether to join in. And some of them will frankly run away. Well, on a ship, you can't run away. You have got to be, let's say you're on a cruiser with a crew of 800 men, and you've got to be as brave as your captain decides to be that day. And whatever you may feel down there in the engine room, that if the captain decides that he's going to charge at the enemy, you're going to go with him. And so it's the captains who set the tone for this. And I often wryly amused that you can always imagine there are quite a lot of men down there below who aren't quite as keen on winning Victoria Crosses as you might be up on the bridge. That's a bit cynical, but all the time you're closing your eyes and trying to think, now what was it like in that situation? And for instance, in the Mediterranean in 1942, what was it like to be in the engine room of one of those warships where you knew there was a very good chance you were going to hit a mine or be torpedoed or bombed? And the statistics show very clearly, and every man in the engine rooms knew very well this was so, that if you were down there in the engine room, your chances of getting out were pretty slight. And how those guys kept going, one's admiration for those people. And they never got their fair share of the gongs, the decorations. The decorations did tend to go overwhelmingly to the men on the upper decks, the men who were the captains on the bridge and their officers, and the men who were firing the guns and so on. But gosh, to be down there in the engine rooms when your ship was badly hit. There was one story which always, again, about the culture of the Royal Navy that made a great impression on me. And that was when the cruiser Edinburgh was hit and known to be going to sink about the same time, but up in the Arctic. And the senior engineering officer was on the upper deck by chance when the ship was sunk. And he was last seen. He said, "I can't leave my guys." And that officer was last seen going back down below to die, to drown with his men. And the courage of some of those guys, how can you not be deeply moved?
No, I completely agree. Okay, Max, moving on to the specific operation, Pedestal Malta, it has a justification in its strategic role, as it were, but you don't think that's really the key to understanding why they did this operation. You talk more about the moral issues beyond territorial or strategic ones. So can you just expand on that a little bit?
Again, I always try to remember, whenever I'm writing anything, the saying, which is all historians have gone with, that Michael Howard often said to me. He said, we always have to remember there was a time when events that are now in the past were still in the future. Now, in August 1942, although with both America and Russia in the war, it was likely that our side were going to win, it was absolutely not certain. And in August 1942, Stalingrad had not yet happened. And a lot of people, some of them in Downing Street, thought the Russians were going to be beaten. They thought that the Germans were going to win on the Eastern Front. And sure, with the Americans out there, somehow, in the end, it was likely that Britain would be on the winning side, but it was absolutely not ordained. And a second thing that's vital to remember, everybody identifies Winston Churchill with 1940. Now, actually, in 1942, he was in a far worse shape politically, because the British people were 2 years tireder than they had been in 1940, and they were weary to death. The Prime Minister kept making these great, stirring speeches about the looming victory and our gallant allies in Russia and across the seas. But all Churchill seemed able to deliver were defeats. Tobruk had just been lost. Singapore had been lost to smaller German and Japanese armies. The British had been evicted from Burma. They had been evicted from Malaya. They'd just taken the most terrible pounding in the desert, so that Rommel was at the gates of Alexandria, at the gates of Egypt. And Churchill was very unpopular. And in fact, Brendan Bracken, one of his closest supporters and ministers, and Brendan Bracken said in the desert, unless Churchill could deliver a victory in the desert, it was going to be the end of it. Now, that was probably an exaggeration, but he might well have been removed from his job as Ministry of Defense, which he also held alongside being Prime Minister. Mm-hmm. So one has to remember what a hole Churchill was in and how utterly depressed he felt in the summer of 1942. Now, Malta, we can say objectively that Malta didn't matter that much, that Malta was this bastion which Churchill would often call the fortress, although it's hard to see why, any more than when he called Malaya a fortress, Singapore a fortress. But he repeatedly hailed the gallant defense of Malta, the fortress, which was under incessant bombardment by German and Italian aircraft. The people were almost starving. There were 300,000 people. The governor of Malta, Lord Gort, reports to Churchill, we'll hold out as long as we can, but the food was due to run out in September. Now, nobody knew then that the Russians were going to win at Stalingrad. Nobody knew that Montgomery was going to win at Alamein. Now, objectively, on the grand picture, lots of historians have said this. They've said, in the end, what did it matter if Malta had to be surrendered? That in the end, once after the American victory at Midway in the Pacific, after Stalingrad had been won, after Montgomery had won, Malta just didn't matter. It wasn't important. But we can say that now. But all Churchill could see is that after all the defeats over which he presided, that if he now had to stand by and say we can no longer feed Malta because 2 or 3 convoys have been hacked to pieces by Axis aircraft and warships attempting to get supplies to Malta, that the blow to the British people would have been appalling. And so Churchill took the decision, and it was very much his personal decision, that Malta must be relieved at any cost. And Britain therefore sent to sea, and it's amazing this story isn't better known already. The largest fleet, the Royal Navy deployed in the West in the whole of the Second World War, and it was only, in fact, nothing bigger happened until the Pacific Fleet, the very last days of the war. But in the West, to deploy 4 aircraft carriers out of the 7 that were all that Britain still possessed, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, counters, destroyers, and smaller ships and submarines. It was an extraordinary commitment to make. Now, there's not much doubt that the senior sailors thought that this was just not worth it. They thought this was madness. They thought Churchill was completely wrong to do this because the risk we'd already seen. We just had only a few months earlier the battleships Prince of Wales, battlecruiser Repulse, sunk in the Pacific by aircraft. The Axis had 600 aircraft deployed around the Mediterranean. And the admirals knew that all these carriers and all these battleships were going to be hideously vulnerable. What's more, although the carriers were good enough as ships, the aircraft they flew off, the Royal Navy was never very good at picking aircraft. And it was a pretty third-rate selection of aircraft, a few Hurricanes, which were obsolescent even in 1940, and even more so in 1942, a modification of the American Wildcat called the Martlet, and another not very impressive fighter of the Royal Navy's own design. These were pretty second-rate planes that were going to have to go up against first-rate German planes. But they knew they had to send a very strong carrier fighter force to have any chance of surviving the air attacks that were going to come. And as for the merchant ships, how they got those guys to sail the ship, 14 merchantmen. And these are civilians, and these guys are being paid peanuts. And you really wonder why some of them, they were told they could go ashore, but they were also told if they did go ashore, they wouldn't be paid, and they'd be held incommunicado in an army camp for at least 6 weeks to deter them from getting off, and hardly anybody did get off. But that those guys on those 14 merchant ships set off, knowing that most of the merchant ships that had tried to sail to Malta before had been blown out of the water. And some of them were so young. I mean, I couldn't get over something that, I mean, the youngest, I think, was a ship's boy, age 14, on one of the merchantmen. The oldest that I've seen was 62, a helmsman on one of the merchant ships. 62, for God's sake. I don't know whether you feel like putting to sea on what, like Pedestal at that age. But and when one of the carriers was badly bombed, and they lost 50 men killed, and they were putting the bodies over the side under white ensigns at sea in the middle of the battle. And the ship's bugler blows the last post, and the ship's bugler of the carrier Indomitable is 15 years old. Wow. And you can imagine this kid standing there who'd been a witness to this rain of bombs descending on these ships. Anyway, the story of those 4 days of this battle. First of all, of course, they endure these terrific air attacks. And they also, on day 1 in the Mediterranean, lovely sunny day, a sort of day for holiday, some of the young midshipmen and so on the big ships, they think this is feeling like a holiday, all sitting there sunbathing on the upper decks and so on. And suddenly, whoop, everybody starts pointing and looking. And they look over to the great carrier Eagle. And this is the first day of this of them in the Mediterranean. And they see the Eagle listing dramatically. And after a minute or two, this huge ship, the carrier, just turns over and turns turtle. And 8 minutes after 4 torpedoes from a German U-boat whack this carrier, all that's left is a lot of heads bobbing in the water. And this is the beginning. And a lot of people wrote in their diaries that I quoted from. They said, from that moment, we realized this was serious. From that moment, one realized. And some of the memories of those people who were aboard that carrier, I mean, some of them, as the carrier went down, and one pilot wrote he'd never forget the terrible screams and shouts coming up through the ventilators from the men trapped in the engine rooms as they often were. Well, in the next 2 days, they endure these appalling air attacks. But the first day of the air attacks, although a rain of bombs descended on them, and there were terrific battles all day, that in the end, by early evening of the 12th of August, they're sort of halfway to Malta, more than halfway to Malta, and all that's happened thus far, all right, they've lost the carrier Eagle, but they were expecting to lose something pretty serious. But also they got 1 merchantman damaged. And people start to think, well, perhaps we're going to come through this thing. Perhaps, all right, the fighter pilots have had the most ferocious battles. We've had this rain of bombs. We've had so many near misses. This isn't looking too bad. But then suddenly, in the ensuing 12 hours, the Royal Navy suffered some of the most devastating shocks of the war. Well, first of all, Stuka dive bombers attacked the carrier Indomitable. This is about 5, 6 o'clock on the 12th of August. And they all watched. They remembered Eagle going down, and they see Indomitable, one of Britain's newest carriers, and they see this stream of Stuka dive bombers descending on it, and wham, 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 3 bombs explode on Indomitable's flight deck. They see the whole, this huge ship shrouded in flame and smoke. And the whole fleet is watching this thing. The 50 ships up, and they're all watching the scene of the carrier. Absolutely streaming smoke. And they were all convinced it was going to go the same way as Eagle had gone the previous day. But miraculously, and brilliant damage control work, although they lost a lot of people killed, and the carrier was unfit to fly off aircraft again, after 10 minutes, they suddenly get the flash signal, situation under control from the carrier. And Indomitable survived. But the admiral, in command of the whole thing, Cypriot, he decided after this, they got to turn around the big ships. They couldn't risk. Remember, this is 4 out of Britain's entire carrier force of 7 carriers, which have been out there in the Mediterranean. And he's already lost 1. And he decides they've got to turn around, and they got the 2 battleships. So the battleships and the carriers turn around. And then they go on with cruisers and 13 of these 14 merchantmen. And it felt pretty lonely for them after watching the spectacle of these huge ships turning around and streaming back towards Gibraltar. And suddenly, although cruisers are big ships, and you've got this big cruiser force of 4 cruisers and all these destroyers and so on. But then the worst has hardly started to happen. First of all, an Italian submarine. And people always mock the Italians, but some of them, including some of their submariners, were very good. And this Italian submarine action delivered one of the most devastating torpedo attacks of the war. That One torpedo hits the cruiser Admiral Burrow's flagship, Nigeria, wham, and Nigeria is suddenly badly hit, unfit to steam any further, miraculously not sunk. Wham, a second torpedo hits another cruiser, Cairo, blows its stern off. Cairo can't be saved. Cairo has to be scuttled. Wham, a third torpedo hits the most important merchant ship in the convoy, the tanker Ohio, and again, flames shooting up in the sky. Everybody else looks at this. They take one look and they think, a tanker full of oil and all the rest of it. This is the end of that. But this was an American-built tanker, probably the strongest ship of its kind in the world, very compartmentalized. And miraculously, after 5 minutes, they got the flames on Ohio under control. And Ohio, although it was lagging behind, it was still able to keep steaming. But Nigeria has got to turn back. And the Admiral made the decision that Nigeria, which is very badly hit, it's lost a lot of people killed, that he's got to send 3 destroyers back as escorts. So he's weakening the rest of the force. And he transfers his flag to the destroyer. And again, the scenes on board Nigeria. And Burrow was a typical Admiral Burrow who took over the rest of it. And he was a typical no-nonsense Christian, never read a book in his life, read the Times sports pages, liked his gin and tonic before lunch. Obviously a lovely man, one of a vast number of children from a Herefordshire parsonage. And he was the absolute muscular Christianity personified. And Burrow transfers his flag to a destroyer. Nigeria turns back and does somehow miraculously manage to limp to Malta. But Cairo, one of the cruisers, is gone. And this terrible period hardly started, even as they're getting sorted out from this disaster. And it was a disaster. Suddenly, nobody's been paying attention to the radar. And suddenly a stream of German and Italian aircraft come storming in and deliver another devastating attack. And they, in the space of a few minutes, sink 2 merchantmen, badly damage 1 or 2 more, and give the fright of their lives. The convoy from that moment, as darkness descended on that terrible day of the 12th, that morale was pretty shattered. And again, what's amazing, they kept going. These guys, all these merchant vessels, so a lot of them very scared, and they admitted they were scared, but they kept going. And Churchill's in Moscow at this time. He's talking to Stalin, who is mocking him relentlessly for the pathetic British performance in the war. And Stalin says, your navy runs away because of what had happened to an Arctic convoy to Russia a few weeks earlier. Mm-hmm. So Churchill's feeling pretty raw and sore, getting a pounding from Stalin. He gets a signal reporting what's going on in the Mediterranean. 1 carrier sunk, 1 carrier badly damaged, 2 cruisers apparently gone. I think terrible signal for Churchill to receive, but he had to go in there and get back and talk to Stalin. And meanwhile, in darkness, these ships are ploughing on. But then, in the early hours of the morning of the 13th of August, they're off the coast of Tunisia, and there's another ghastly surprise waiting for them. A whole stream of Italian and German so-called E-boats, torpedo boats, high-speed boats, 40 knots, best part of 50 miles an hour, tearing in to attack them. And these boats start firing their torpedoes and inflicting devastating new damage. And some people lose their nerve. The convoy, so-called Commodore, our merchant officer, said, we must turn back to Gibraltar. And he ordered the ship he was on turn around, and 2 others followed him, until a destroyer caught up with them and said, you will jolly well turn back and head for Malta, which they rather reluctantly and belatedly did. But these torpedo boats, whamming these merchantmen in the middle of the night, 3 more merchantmen hit in the night, and worst of all, a cruiser, biggest cruiser with the fleet, huge ship with crew of 800 or 900 men. This is hit by torpedoes, and its captain, quite frankly, lost his nerve. He decided the ship couldn't be saved. They're a few miles off the coast of North Africa. He made the decision, even though his engineering officers told him that they thought they could regain power. He said, no, he said, it's hopeless. He said, when daylight comes, we'll just be hit by air attack. If we get everybody off now, then we can save everybody's lives. And so he ordered the cruiser Manchester to scuttle. Well, a few months later, he was court-martialed for that because Churchillian crusades are not won by humanity. And in peacetime, of course, the decision he made would be absolutely the right decision. He saved the lives of 800 men. His decision was absolutely the right one, but almost certainly the next morning, the Italian and German aircraft would have caught up with them, the ship would have been sunk, and all those men would have been, a lot of them would have been lost. But that's not the way you win wars. So Captain Drew of the Manchester was convicted by the court-martial and never held another seagoing command. And his men were jolly grateful. I mean, they rowed to the shore and they returned by the Vichy French, but Manchester went to the bottom. And so you've now got this drastically depleted fleet on the morning of the 14th of August. They're only 102 miles from Malta, but the admiral up on the bridge of his temporary flagship, a destroyer, and he's talking to the captain about rugger, because this is what you do if you're being watched. You know, every man on that ship's watching you, and you're all, and so you've got to put on a show. And they were brilliant at putting on a show. And a rating comes up from the radio room, and he reads off a signal of all the ships that have been sunk during the night. And Barrow just nods and says, very good, and then goes back and carries on talking about rugby. This is what you have to do if you're an admiral of the Royal Navy in the midst of a disaster. But their troubles were not by any means over. That an hour or two after daylight, the Axis Air Forces come through again, and they hit the biggest merchant shipment convoy, mostly carrying ammunition, called Weimaraner, and it blows up. And there's a colossal explosion, and the sea is suddenly awash with flaming fuel. And there are men screaming in the midst of it all. And the courage some of these people displayed. That, first of all, one of the destroyers, the admiral sent a signal to one of the destroyers saying, survivors, but don't go into the flames. Well, the captain took no notice and drove his ship straight into the flaming sea with his men playing hoses on the decks to keep the water, and he pulled 40-odd survivors out of the water. His ship's cook comes up on deck, and he's the ship's water polo captain, and he takes one look at what's going on, and he takes off his apron, dives straight into the water, and swims to start pulling men out of the water. And what these people did is amazing. Anyway, Weimaraner's gone, and another ship went that morning, and you've only got 3 ships left with the admiral. And with the on the afternoon of the 14th of August, that the admiral hands over these ships just short of Malta, 2 ships coming out from Malta, and those 3 ships get into Malta. But the story's not over by a long chalk. I mean, every single ship in this fleet you could write a separate book about. I mean, it's a quite extraordinary story. One merchantman, which had been hit by a torpedo, had been creeping along the coast of North Africa, and it was a miracle they were still afloat. And frankly, half their crew lost their nerve. And a delegation went up to the bridge and said to the captain, a guy called Fred Riley, they said, we want to take this ship into port here in Tunisia, neutral Tunisia, and we can all be interned and the war's over. But they said, if you try and dash from Malta 150 miles across the open sea, we're all gone. We've got a ship with a stocking great hull made by a torpedo in it. And Fred Riley and some of his men, they had the guts. They just told them all to sod off. and they said, we are going on to Malta. And so Fred Riley and his crew were all, I mean, what a crew. I mean, they were all, even the naval liaison officer had told Riley that he thought they were probably doomed. But they made this terrific last dash for Malta. And a few hours after the earlier three made it, that suddenly this ship, Brisbane Star, suddenly appears and amazes everybody. It sails into Grand Harbour, Malta. And the fact that Fred Riley, he got the same DSO other captains got, frankly, I mean, you feel he should have got the VC for what he did with a mutiny among his crew. And it was effectively a mutiny, as well as all the rest of it. So that's another story. But the last bit was the best bit, because the tanker Ohio was hit repeatedly by bombs, and streams of German bombs landed on and around it. And by the 14th of August, Ohio is about 150 miles short of Malta. It's being escorted by 3 destroyers. Its engines are stopped. It's got 2 crashed German aircraft on its deck. Or sorry, 1 crashed Italian and 1 crashed German aircraft on its deck. And it's slowly sinking. It's been hit in so many places. And all that day, aircraft keep appearing. It's pretty scary for not only the men on the ship, but the men on the destroyers around it. They know that if this ship explodes, as could will happen, then they're going to go out with it. And yet, again, they all kept going. And the sort of madness, they're all exhausted. The captain of one of the destroyers had the brilliant idea. They lashed 1 destroyer to each side of Ohio and started dragging it the last 100 miles. And the men were so exhausted that most of them were sleepwalking. Both the destroyers were crammed with survivors from other ships. Every time German and Italian aircraft appeared, they were absolutely terrified. They had nothing to do. The captain of one of the destroyers brought his gramophone up on the bridge and started playing Glenn Miller over the ship's broadcast system. Some of the men on board Ohio manning the guns got at the rum and got at the drink supplies, and some of them were absolutely plastered out of their minds. One found a container of party hats, and they all put on these party hats, and some of them were manning Bofors guns on the Ohio, wearing Christmas party hats. So there's a sort of madness about this, but it was a sort of inspired madness, and by a sort of miracle, they managed to drag this tanker slowly sinking the last 100 miles to Grand Harbour, and they drag it round. The defences of Malta opened fire on them in the last few hours in darkness, which caused a certain loss of temper on the bridges of some of the ships. But on the morning of the 15th of August, which is one of the most important festivals in Malta's history, the Festival of Santa Maria, the patron saint of the island, with thousands of Maltese cramming the harbour and bands playing, Ohio, the tanker, with 85% of its fuel still intact, is dragged into Grand Harbour. And everybody's in tears. I mean, they're in tears on the shore, they're in tears on the... And it was quite extraordinary. I mean, it was an amazing, as I say, there are 100 separate epics in this story. And some naval historians have written brutally that they think you have to regard this as an Axis picture, because the Axis, the Germans, the Italians, they inflicted so much damage on the Royal Navy and on the merchant vessels. 9 ships out of 14 sunk, not to mention all the warships that were destroyed. But I've argued very strongly that war is above all a contest of wills, and I do believe that at that moment it was enormously important that the British showed the world that they could still fight, that they were still. And Churchill made a point of writing himself to Stalin, listing all the ships that were sunk, because the great cry from Stalin and the Russians were the British were frightened of dying. They were frightened of losing people, when the Russians were losing them in millions. Yeah. And Churchill made a point of saying we've lost some of the best ships in the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy to do this. And the Americans, never forget that opinion polls were showing Americans in 1942 had a very low opinion of the British because of all these defeats. And there was an opinion poll in the summer of 1942, asked Americans who they thought was trying hardest to win the war. And the figures were amazing. And of course, inevitably, most said the Americans. But after the Americans, they then chose the Chinese and then the Russians. And the British were somewhere down there, hardly on the Richter scale.
Yeah.
But the Americans failed. So I think it was enormously important in showing the world and showing the United States and the Russians that the British still had the guts to bear the sacrifices and to do this stuff. And I found it one of the most moving stories I've ever written.
Yeah, well, I mean, thank you, Max. That's a wonderful retelling of it. And I can assure you it's incredibly moving to read. I mean, I think there's something about naval history and the story of ships and the constant danger, particularly once they're in that area of potential attack from bombs and torpedo boats and submarines, that it's just tense. Every minute is tense. You can't escape the feeling. And I bet you it felt a bit like that, to be truthful, when you were on the convoy down in the Falklands, that you never know where danger is going to come from. Therefore, you're constantly on edge.
Well, it always amused me in the Falklands that all the ship's captains have been brought up on the same black and white British war movies that we all saw when we were kids. And they sort of took their scripts from that, so that one day when Argentine air attacks were heading in, and I was on the bridge of a frigate, Arrow, and the captain broadcast the ship's company, and he said, "Remember, lads, when they come, give them hell." And I thought, he's been watching too many episodes of The Cruel Sea and all that, and everybody everybody knew they were sort of acting out a part in a British drama that was sort of left over from World War II, because it was a very World War II-y sort of war.
Yeah.
So the fact that one had seen this stuff happen, and I remembered when one of the when they saw on the destroyer Ledbury on Pedestal, when they saw a pilot coming down the sea, parachuting into the sea, they dashed to get him, hoping he was a British pilot. It turned out to be German. And half the crew shouted from the deck, "Throw him back, throw him back." And again, in the Falklands, I remember being rather shocked that when an Argentine pilot parachuted over San Carlos Bay, and every gun in the anchorage opened up on him, and it was a reflection of what rotten shots they were that nobody hit him. But nonetheless, an awful lot of infantrymen around the shore were blazing away with rain guns and even rifles to try and kill this wretched Argentine pilot on his parachute. So I'm afraid that's what happened, and one did see some of this stuff.
Yeah. Max, let me ask you last couple of extra questions, because you've covered almost all the bases I was going to talk about, and we'll probably add in the odd question just to break it up a little bit when they do the piece in the paper. But one or two couple of extra bits, just give a little bit of insight into some of the research you did for this, because there were so many wonderful details. I mean, I could think of at least 20 things that I just thought, wow, where on earth did you get that from? And I love the story of the Canarino, the canary. This Second World War drone, which clearly didn't work very well. But how did you end up finding nuggets like that?
Every book I write, I try and think, where can I look for materials that other people haven't found? And the British, to this day, have a bad habit of treating the Italians in the Second World War as sort of a joke. And in fact, I asked one of the best writers on this period, a naval historian, I asked him if he'd done any research in Italian sources. And he said he hadn't, because, and this is what's so tough about if you're not on the bestseller list, he said, frankly, the advance he got for his book about Pedestal just didn't justify the research in Italy. But I'm lucky enough, these days, one can spend the money to do the research. So I've got a brilliant Italian translator, and she did a hell of a lot of work for me on Italian sources. And that was a big plus to stick all that in. I also did a lot of work on German sources. And as far as the British stuff goes, there were 20,000 men aboard those ships. And a surprising number of them kept diaries and wrote letters. And of course, I trawled every single one of those in the Imperial War Museum and other archives. And also I was able, Admiral Burroughs' daughter, one of his daughters, is still alive, aged 96, and the family were very helpful to me, and one of the relations has still got a lot of the paperwork from one of Admiral Burroughs' staff, from his secretary. You would claim, like a lot of these things, you're not going to find a great revelation here. But first of all, I'd like to hope that one looked at it in a new way. And secondly, it is one of the great stories of the Second World War that is too little known, that I'm amazed how many people, even quite serious historians who say to me, they say, gosh, we never knew about Pedestal. And this was a huge story. I mean, it was one of the biggest naval events of the Second World War. So I'm only thrilled. I found it absolutely fascinating to write about it.
I think there's a really good chance, given that I've recently watched Greyhound. I don't know if you've seen that, Max. It's on Amazon, so it's not the easiest thing to watch these days. The Tom Hanks thing. I think it's based on a C.S. Forester novel. I might be wrong in that, but of course, it's Second World War. It's very, very similar to your story, but they've bodged that together, frankly, from some events that are true and some not true. I mean, how much better to tell the story of Operation Pedestal, the true story, in proper cinematographic detail. I mean, it would make the most wonderful film. So you never know that your book may well be optioned at some stage. I suspect people reading it are going to be stunned by the drama that there is in the story of a convoy. I think you make the point at the beginning, don't you, that how on earth, is it likely that the story of a convoy can be that exciting? Well, the fact is it can. But anyway, that was just an observation. My question in relation to that, Max, is really going back to the beginning. Given that you've now seen the opportunities, frankly, of writing about the Navy, do you think you might do more of this in the future?
I don't know. I can only focus on one thing at a time. I'm writing on the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and all you can do, you have to be incredibly focused, as you know so well, when you're writing a book. So all I'm thinking about at the moment is the Cuban Missile Crisis. But when that's over, who knows? That there are fantastic stories out there of the Royal Navy, both from World War II and earlier.
Yeah. No, one final thing, Max. One of the things I've always found so refreshing about your books is your willingness to engage with the darkness as well as the light, as it were. So you've never pulled your punches when you're talking about people who, even given the context of the time, have clearly failed in their duty. And you've already mentioned a couple of people up till now. I mean, there are many stories in this, but there are also many wonderful stories of extraordinary heroism. And again, you cover those. But one of the things that I found most jarring, and you've already alluded to it, but if you could just say a little bit more about it, is the unwillingness, frankly, for the Royal Navy, maybe understandably at the time, to have any kind of bad press immediately. And therefore, people like you mentioned the skipper, in fact, the Commodore, who really effectively does a runner and is later given the same medal as the extraordinary story of the merchant ship that comes through. And there's just something jarring about that. Something sticks in the craw a little bit, doesn't it?
The whole truth, my dear, about the old truth of every veteran always says to each other, the only man who knows what a decoration is worth is the one who won it. And this is true in all wars, in that I've often come across quite shocking stories of people who've been pretty disgracefully awarded DSOs and other things. And very often, I'm afraid, sort of generals and admirals' favorites get the decorations and so on, and other wonderful people are left out. So it's not unique to Pedestal, that. But all one tries to do, on the whole, what's amazing about wars is that most people, it's not most people, how well most people behave. Yep. But all I don't believe in is airbrushing out the people who do not behave so well. Because, one thing I always remember writing about land battles is that a very experienced American officer wrote, he said, about a quarter of your people in an infantry attack, a quarter of people carry your attack, and about half of your people sort of come along behind somewhere, and the other quarter, if you're lucky, may turn up afterwards. And that's the way it is in all wars. And you just have to be incredibly naive to think everybody's heroes. And one problem Churchill had was that Churchill, because he himself was a hero, he was always expecting everybody else to be heroes. And he was very shocked when people did not behave like that. He was bewildered, genuinely bewildered. It was a great episode. In August 1942, the same period, when he addressed a lot of British troops in the desert about, he said, I told them of the wonderful laurels that would be theirs if they played their part in the coming battle. And I wrote about that particular remark of Churchill's, which he wrote in a letter to Clementine. And I said the truth was an awful lot of people in that desert army, they were civilians in uniform. They weren't remotely interested in winning gongs. What they wanted here was what sort of Britain they were going to come back to if they were lucky enough to survive the war. And Churchill never thought about that at all, which is one reason they chucked him out of power in 1945. So you always have to be thinking what's going on in people's minds and they were not all aboard those Royal Navy ships. They were not all happy bunnies. A lot of them would have loved to be somewhere else. That it's all right for the career naval officers up on the bridge. This is what they do for a living. But a lot of those people down below were sort of grocers' assistants and bank clerks and so on, who all they wanted to do was survive and go home. And that wasn't too easy in the Mediterranean in 1942.
No, I can see. Okay, Max, listen, thank you so much for giving your time for this. Wonderful, wonderful book. I'm going to keep my eyes on the bestseller list in the next couple of weeks because I'm sure it'll be there. And I hope it keeps selling all through the rest of the year, actually, because you're out quite early, aren't you? It's unusual for you, isn't it? This early.
Well, that's what we decided to do. But anyway, my dear, lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, great to talk to you, Max.
I do hope you enjoyed that. 2 veteran historians there, and at least one of whom is a true legend. It was quite funny listening back, actually, because about halfway through, when Max was telling the story about the ship's cook, who was also the water polo captain, he received a call right in the middle. Well, obviously I edited that out, but it was quite amusing listening to Max having to deal with an unwanted call in the middle of a highly important interview for Aspects of History. Water polo is dangerous. To quote Tony Curtis, I'll say, I had 2 ponies drown under me. I have more to follow in the coming weeks, including Elizabethan secret agents, Oliver Cromwell, and crime in Second World War London. If you can leave me a review or subscribe, I'd be hugely grateful. But as ever, thank you and good night.